Pakistan is facing an increase in attacks by the Pakistan Taliban. Just last month, the militants stormed a police compound in Karachi. The group is also suspected to be behind a suicide bombing in January that killed at least 100 in a mosque in Peshawar. The attacks have increased since the group walked out of a peace deal with the Pakistan government last November. Since then, at least 100 attacks in the country have been blamed on them. Most have targeted police personnel. It's left the government in a dilemma. How can Pakistani citizens feel safe when police themselves don't?
A police officer at this outpost in Peshawar, in northwestern Pakistan, is kitted out with a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. It's part of a new campaign to help security forces fight back against a spate of attacks by Pakistani Taliban. It's one of dozens of scattered outposts in a zone where the police face almost daily assaults by militants. The Pakistani Taliban, known as the TTP, has stepped up its activity, including the deadliest single attack on the force, a mosque bombing that killed over 80 police in Peshawar in late January. These outposts stand at the edge of the government's full control, facing mountainous areas and their militant hideouts along the Afghan border. Peshawar is just over 50 kilometres from the Afghan frontier, through the Khyber Pass, a key trade route and a strategic military location. The biggest problem we face is the number of personnel, which is a little low. We have a good number of weapons inside our ground floor store. This is a targeted area, and we're absolutely face to face with the militants. The intensive training is aimed at boosting skills and morale. The number of police killed has been rising sharply, up to 119 last year, from 54 in 2021. More than 2,100 personnel have been killed since 2001. The Taliban's stated aim is to impose Islamic religious law in Pakistan, just as they did across the border. Pakistani forces have scored a string of military victories since 2014, but Taliban fighters were able to regroup. Attacks on police officers have escalated since the hurried departure from Afghanistan of NATO forces in 2021.
They have been disproportionately affected. That's a fact. I'm not going to sit here and say that the police in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa has been given all the protection, as much protection as the state can give. But the threat that is emanated is of a very unique nature.
Local police complain that they're underpaid and have a lower status than the Pakistani army. Electricity is in short supply. Plus, dealing with an insurgent in a suicide vest is a daunting prospect, even for well-trained, well-equipped personnel.
Joining me now for more context on this is Michael Kugelman. He's director of the South Asia Institute at the Wilson Center think tank in Washington, D.C. Michael, what is the Taliban endgame in Pakistan?
Well, I think the Taliban, or the TTP as the Pakistan Taliban is known, is keen to replicate in Pakistan what the Taliban in Afghanistan was able to do in that country. It's not something that the TTP will be able to do, but it wants to try. And this is why we're seeing in recent months intensifying attacks by the TTP on the security establishment, on state forces, on the army, on soldiers, and indeed, and especially in recent weeks, on police as well.
Surely the Pakistan Taliban knows and understands that it can't entirely defeat the Pakistani state. And if that is the case, is it just a case of hedging their bets and seeing how far they can go?
Yeah, that's certainly part of it. And also, I mean, the TTP has long had a fight to wage against Pakistani security forces that it views as having been allied with the U.S. government when it was waging its war in Afghanistan. And certainly the TTP has long been very unhappy about how the Pakistani military has staged counterterrorism offensives against the TTP that have, of course, eliminated many TTP fighters over the years. So on many levels, what we're seeing with this TTP campaign in Pakistan now is a campaign of revenge, trying to hit out at the Pakistani security forces army and police. And I think that one reason we're seeing so many attacks on police in recent weeks is that I think the TTP views the police as somewhat of a more easier and therefore attractive target than Pakistani security forces, particularly as we've seen the police unfortunately have lacked the capacity to quickly end these very sophisticated assaults that the TTP has carried out. And we've seen, particularly in the most recent case, army commandos have to come in to try to end these assaults by the TTP.
And how much support does it have from the Afghan Taliban, as Pakistan's government alleges it does?
Well, I mean, the Afghan Taliban and the Pakistani Taliban have long been closely allied. They're not the same organization. They're different, but they've long been ideologically aligned. And for quite some time when the war in Afghanistan was being waged, you had a number of instances where Pakistani Taliban fighters would work alongside Afghan Taliban fighters. So operationally, they were cooperating as well. Now, the TTP has long been loyal to the Afghan Taliban, and it has long professed its allegiance to the supreme leadership of the Afghan Taliban. And the Afghan Taliban returns the favor, quite frankly. It is providing space, if not sanctuary, to the senior TTP leadership inside Afghanistan. Now, I'm not saying that the Afghan Taliban is arming the TTP and sending it into Pakistan to carry out attacks, but the Afghan Taliban is certainly looking the other way, to say the least, when it comes to the TTP enjoying space and sanctuary in Afghanistan and crossing the border into Pakistan to carry out attacks.
Does the TTP also serve any strategic ideals or strategic goals that the Afghan Taliban has when it comes to dealing with the Pakistan government?
Well, I mean, perhaps the Afghan Taliban looks at the TTP as a source of leverage in the sense that it hopes that maybe it could get something out of Pakistan, get Pakistan to make some type of major concession to the Afghan Taliban in return for the Afghan Taliban making concessions to Pakistan on the TTP issue. For instance, the possibility of trying to get Pakistan to recognize the Afghan Taliban regime, and then in return the Afghan Taliban would try to make some concessions, such as perhaps trying to pressure TTP leaders to leave Afghanistan. I don't actually think that's going to be the case, but I do think that there's something to this idea that maybe the Afghan Taliban thinks it can use the TTP as a bargaining chip to try to get something out of the Pakistani state.
Islamabad has also long had links with the Afghan Taliban. So why isn't it being able to prevail on Kabul to end this support of the Pakistan Taliban?
Well, one factor is the very close links between the two Talibans. Let's put it this way: the Afghan Taliban is allied with many militant groups that are based in Afghanistan and Pakistan, from Al Qaeda to a number of regional terrorist groups. And the Afghan Taliban has never turned on any of these militant allies. It is fighting against the Islamic State Khorasan, but Islamic State Khorasan has always been a rival of the Taliban. So the Taliban in Afghanistan has never turned on any of its militant allies, including the TTP. So that's one factor. I also think that the Taliban in Afghanistan wants to assert its independence from Pakistan, from its former patron. It was long dependent on Pakistan for sanctuary when the war in Afghanistan was raging. But now that the war has ended for now, I think that the Taliban wants to show the Afghan people, who on many levels mistrust Pakistan in a big way, that the Taliban no longer has to be reliant on Pakistan. It's no longer going to do its bidding. It's no longer going to roll over and kowtow to the Pakistani state and do what Pakistan asked the Taliban to do. So I think that's another factor at play as well.
In 2014, Michael, after the Pakistan Taliban attacked an army school in Peshawar, the Pakistan Army, upped its offensive against the militants. Do you see a similar response taking shape now?
Yeah, certainly there's a big debate raging in Pakistan now about what type of response we might see, what type of kinetic response we might see from the Pakistani military. But I think it's unlikely we'll see anything akin to what happened in 2014 anytime soon, because for one reason, it's a very fractured political environment in Pakistan right now. And so there's no broader political consensus in favor of a major counterterrorism offensive. Also, there's a severe economic crisis in Pakistan right now. Pakistan could be just weeks away from a default. And so I think that economically it could be very difficult to muster the resources at this point to mount a major counterterrorism offensive against the TTP. And another issue is I think that the army would have to figure out what type of offensive it would want to actually mount. It's a tough decision because the senior TTP leadership is based in Afghanistan. So the most effective tactical operation might be one that involves operations in Afghanistan. But that could really set tensions. It could really put tensions with the Taliban in Afghanistan on an even higher level, which is a big risk for Pakistan. But if it limits a potential offensive only to Pakistan, it may not get to the root of the problem, which is in Afghanistan.
We'll leave it there. Always a pleasure talking to you, Michael Kugelman. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.